as a contribution to this conference, I wanted to do something which is much too ambitious. I wanted to compare Piaget's constructivism, as I understood it while I was working at the Piaget Institute, Pappert's constructionism, as I understood it while I was working with the learning and epistemology at the Media Lab, and then with many other people in Europe and the US. And I wanted to compare this with the tradition of social cultural theories that that was epitomized by Lev Vygotsky, but there are many, many other researchers and thinkers in this trend. Now, in my paper, I developed this analysis as well as I could, so I don't want to use my 20 minutes here to repeat what I did there. So what I would like to do here is just to give a few bullet points on what I believe to be each of the contributions. Then I want to actually attempt to integrate the views instead of putting them in dichotomies. And if I have time, which I probably will not have, because I'm always slower than I think I am, will be to see how some of these ideas can help when we think about the ways in which today's children have come to play and learn, to think about themselves, relate to other people, dwell into space, and treat things as different from the ways in which children like myself did at their age. So I would like to address some of the generational changes that none of my masters may have addressed in a similar way, maybe except for actually the social constructivists. They give good tools to deal with these differences. So let me just start by saying that I think that constructivists, Sionists, constructionists and constructivists of all board would agree that children are extraordinary learners. And what I mean by that is that they are born with a knack to do the right thing in order to know more about what they don't know yet. Learning is all about knowing how to deal with circumstances of uncertainty where actually what you know cannot just be blank, applied as such. It has to do with dealing with what you don't understand yet. Also, the constructivists of all board, I think, would agree that learning is less about acquiring information or about transmitting existing values or ideas than it is about individually and collectively imagine and create a world in which it is worth living. This sounds very pompous, but it is not. Because one of the things that you notice, and that Piaget showed very well, is that when a kid is interested in a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. People are very good at creating for themselves the conditions that allow them to best explore what intrigues and interests them, to best navigate in this world of uncertainties. So my whole perspective, in a way, is to show that so-called misconception theories of learning are usually missing the point, because what they don't get is what Piaget has shown so beautifully, and I think Seymour Papert also insisted on, is that children have very strong reasons not to abandon their belief systems when they are just surface perturbations offered to them. I call them surface perturbations because I put myself from the point of view of the child, that even if those suggestions, invitations are better than the ways in which the children have actually come to negotiate the boundaries with the world, to regulate their exchanges with the world, and so on. So in a way, to put it caricaturally, it's almost better sometimes to think of education as psychotherapy, and of, because at least in psychotherapy, at least the European style, you don't help before people ask for it. And you usually, if you're a good therapist, you don't give solutions, but you just build on what people tell you to try to offer different perspectives that eventually allow them to do things in slightly different fashions. And added to this is the notion also that psychotherapy doesn't have to be verbal. There are many people who invented all kinds of tools, manipulatives and so on, for people to precisely be able to use those invitations. It can be rituals, scenarios, practices, it can be objects that allow them to operate these light switches. I'm still in my introduction, I didn't even start with Piaget, so that tells you how far I'm going to get. So, the contributions of constructivism, I have a sort of little memo for myself. They are all the ends. Piaget has studied people as world makers, not making as hands-on, please, as you said, Richard. What Seymour Papert has added, which is very important, is the notion that actually learning is design. Don Schoen had the same idea, that learning is a conversation with and through artifacts. And what Vygotsky adds to the package, to the equation, is the notion that children are active and creative contributors to their culture. This is a little bit slanted. When I go into Vygotsky, it will become more complicated. My attempt to do an integration is actually to take on ideas by Keegan and by other people who think that the most important is actually to move between worlds. It's something that Marvin Minsky has explained beautifully. Marvin Minsky said, a phenomenon has a meaning only if it has at least two or three. Meaning, whatever you teach in mathematics, in early mathematics, because I work more with young children, it's not that you have to try to push one approach to understanding the concept of number versus another. What matters, if you want people to build invariants, offer variations. So let's say one approach to geometry is the school one, where you look at it from a God's eyes view, you do it in an analytical way, you try to understand the patterns in the geometric figures. Another one is what I would like to call the contribution of turtle geometry, which is to think of actually the same, let's say, geometrical figures or patterns in terms of how they have been built and in terms of what kinds of technologies have been used to build them. It's not the same to think about a circle, as Ulrich said, in terms of points equidistant from a center or a differential, and people have preferences in thinking about the circle in one way or another, depending on how fluent they are in the tools and technology that allow them to build and to approach and to somehow come to understand some of the phenomena using certain tools. Now, let me go to, and then what I wanted to do in the second part, but I think we talk about it later in the conference. What I wanted to do is to actually talk about today's learners, but from a psychological point of view and not an educational point of view. Because there is a lot of talk about 21st century learning and teaching, what the children should know to become the active and smart contributors to the culture as a whole. My problem with these approaches, although much of the work is very good and many of my friends are involved in it, is that it's always adults' projections of what the youngsters should be doing to achieve this and that and the other purposes, whether it is finding a job in a bank or being a good constructionist. So I have developed over the age a certain kind of resistance to any kind of sort of militancy, some kind of very strong ideas about what people should be doing. And I would like in the second part, which will never come, but you can talk about this after, what I want to do is to show some of the things that the kids are actually doing. I am eating my own soup. In my first life at the Piaget Institute, I studied how children think of the world to actually try to be adaptive in the kinds of things that interest them. Same goes with 21st century learner, the so-called digital natives. So I have a whole thing about what they like to do. I'll never get there, but at least you have the program. I wanted also to push the envelope of the constructivist contribution, and this is something that James said in the introduction. While the constructivists are very good at, you see my M's here, at helping to understand how people actually learn, not just learn by doing, but are world makers, and how they read what others have done, including their own artifacts in the light of what interests them. The constructivists have sometimes not developed well enough what I call the qualities that are required to use imagination and poetics at the service of thinking and reasoning. And there are people within this broad envelope of constructionists who actually have done a lot in that respect. I'm thinking of Dewey, who has offered quite a contribution, pragmatists on play, the importance of pretense and simulation in learning. I think that make-believe, that actually is an activity that starts at age 2 when children enter in the symbolic function. The possibility of suspension of disbelief, as they call it, or doing as if, playing what if, is paramount, and this is Piaget who said it, paramount to what intelligence is all about. Because it allows to establish a dialogue between what is and what could be, between actualities and possibilities, between the narrative as it happens to me just now versus the narrative as I would like it to happen. And people need transitional spaces, objects, and social routines with other people to be able to safely explore these dangerous and intriguing ideas in ways that they can actually contrast the way things have felt in certain situations and how they would like them to be. Now, my discourse is very general, but it is not, because you can think in the same way whether you think of the microworld in Seymour Papert sense or whether you think of the microworld in Sherry Turkle sense. In both cases, what the microworld offers is a way to explore, reenact, revisit, re-represent a series of otherwise invisible or hard to access, I call them phenomenon, whether they are of affective or cognitive style, and without the creation of that micro world or of that third place or of that transitional place, the learners wouldn't have an easy way to explore it in the conditions in which they are. This is my $2.50 interpretation of Seymour's insistence that the micro world is not a simulation of the real world, but it offers actually a playground, literally a playground to explore otherwise hidden, invisible phenomena in sciences, but it can also be in other aspects. It's funny because I never started my talk. I think I will never get there because my time is almost over, but it doesn't matter. in looking at today's children, what I want to do, and this is maybe the part that interests me a great deal, is to look at how actually children and young people, what they are doing when they are doing what we call they just click around and do things like this, versus being really into the kinds of very clever assignments that we offer to them. I am being a little bit demagogical. But I think that if you look at it carefully, if you listen carefully, you realize that many of the things that the so-called digital natives do are very creative and clever ways to cope with the kinds of challenges that they have in today's life. And maybe I will just go a little bit into this. How much time do I have left? 5 minutes?
7.
7, okay. Let me start with, I said there are different changes. The first I call a culture of sharism. This is very much along the lines of James G. But the kids are doing what James G says. It's new ways of relating to people and of relating to people to get the work done. What I pull out of this is that it is a growing precedence in how youngsters work of co-creation over individual construction, or we could call it information brokerage over personal elaboration. The kids proceed outside in Vygotsky's sense, and they are not just acting in the world or creating things as a means to understand who they are and how to get a handle of the world, as Piaget had it, but they don't just externalize ideas, project them out, make them tangible and shareable in the way Papert said. What's happening is slightly different, and it's a shocker. Today's kids, one could say, mingle before they make, they share before they think, they go public before they are sure of anything, disseminating half-baked ideas, either found or self-made, which they then pass along and massage, reconfigure, repurpose together instead of keeping them to themselves. They often do so with kindred spirits, present or absent, before they seek help or recognition from knowledgeable adults. So much for Vygotsky about the knowledgeable adults. Now, needless to say that this form of sharism calls for trustworthy allies, and it has advantages and disadvantages. I wrote papers in which I show which they are, and how educators can tap into this preference of children while not falling into it, while actually helping them doing things that they otherwise wouldn't do if they were just let drift along. One of the things is, if you become an information broker, and if you share before you think, and if you just pass on information, the best thing to do for an educator is give them time to massage long enough so that whatever they borrow, they actually transform, retransform, long enough until it becomes an expression of who they are or of what they want to be. If you have no time, you are an information broker, it's of no interest. The second related sort of trend or preference, as one may call it, is this notion of plural identity or fluid selves. More than in previous generations, today kids seem to exist and evolve in multiple realms, physical, virtual, and digital. And not just one after the other, but sometimes at the same time and in very interesting and complex ways. Their sense of self is more distributed, and in their play they may take on different personas, which they then incorporate as a host of voices within. This is very much like Bakhtin and what the Russian tradition has talked about. Now, clearly putting on a mask is not new. Role play, carnivals, people do it. But digital environments have this particularity that they let you wear several hats at once In other words, you can explore different aspects of yourself in different contexts, and in each you will be taken at face value. So the challenge for today's children is to invent new ways of tackling this tension between these different aspects of their personality. Again, there are pros and cons, and maybe educators can think about how to embrace this need to actually explore these different aspects of themselves without losing themselves, losing the internal equilibrium or something persistent in who they are that we call identity. Border crossing is in a way the physical facet of the same idea. It's in a way about moving across, is to engage in parallel adventure, moving across border, trying to see what's on the other side, being interested at what they don't know yet, and so forth. And in a way, again, it's not new. People have traveled forever. Kids have had pen pals. But the technologies allow actually the youngsters to enjoy the differences to other cultures that they don't know, maybe because they don't have to live with them and to share the kitchen and bathroom with them. I don't know. But it's anyway an interesting kind of difference. An important one, and I think in this audience I don't have to insist too much on this, is that the notion of literacy is changing. And the only point that I want to make here is that the gap is closing between reading and writing. And the gap is closing between oral and written. I think that what the technologies allow is for children to actually do annotations of things that already exist, and then to structure their annotations instead of writing from a blank page, which is wonderful because we all do it, except that they do it in very, very, sometimes not very sophisticated way, and the biggest problem for educators is what they call plagiarism. Again, it's something that we have to think about, but we learn through copying and modifying what we copy. Of course, you have to recognize your sources, but actually they have a very good idea to use these methods. Culture of gaming and simuling has to do with a growing expectation, and this is important, that the tools at hand they are used to use computational tools that are responsive and forgiving, almost like that allow them to experience things as if for good and safely, and that allow them to reiterate because you can always keep the original. So there is less risk. And this is very important because this is why you see these properties that I talk about work as a system. This is why they can allow themselves to put out as a first draft a real, like, crap. Or start sharing because they know that they can iterate. And they know that actually the refinement will come from the iteration. Last and not least, and this requires a lot of thinking, is that more than in previous generation, today kids are bricoleurs in Levi-Strauss's sense. They are hackers, makers, and hobbyists. They are also amateur professionals, eager to collect, create, and trade things. They make things, do things, they repurpose, mend, trade things. This is all about the do-it-yourself culture, the maker's fair. I have been in one in San Francisco. It was quite an experience, and about digital crafts. Now, this is my favorite because we may think that this is just like wild out there and crazy. But if one would look carefully at what happens, of how these people actually create a structure for themselves to be able to be, I call them caring geeks. Geeks that actually don't just consume, purchase, and dispose, but that actually modify the objects that they find to give them properties that give the objects and themselves power, like have the objects do weird things, have the clothes blink. I think of the work of Léa Bouchelet and so on. And I think that it is a wonderful model of what it means to learn by doing. And if you compare what happens in these kinds of environments to what some of the educators call learning by doing, you realize that there is a lot to be learned. And my final word is, I am a psychologist, and what I wanted to do here is to just offer a perspective between the technologists who often think that the learning is in, the concept to be constructed is embedded in the technology sometimes, even the constructionists one, and the other ones who are educators and who always try to give solutions to people before they even look at what they want to do. In the debates about 21st century learning, there is no voice for the learners themselves. It's the educators who talk about what they should be doing, what would be better for them, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Edith. So we have 1 minute for a very short question, please.
I think we can talk after. Hey, everybody's here.
Yes, we're all together. It's so exciting. Okay, something I learned from you over and over and over again, which I only came to realize how important it was, well, over many years, over the last 20 years. So, but it is this role of the author, the role of the meaning maker, the role of not the sort of the mind of the constructionist in deciding what those artifacts will be, but also in this context of the social creation of knowledge. And I, first of all, just have to thank you so much for that. But so how do you see where we're going to go as, are we going to become social constructionists, as we talked about 20 years ago? But that has other meanings for people in philosophy and in epistemology, which are not so good.
I can only tell you what I have been doing
That's my question.
recently. What I have been doing recently is to look into more ecological, pragmatic theories of human learning and development. I went back to looking at Bateson, good old Bateson, but there is a whole tradition of ecological theories. And what I find important is that they transcend debates between Vygotsky, Piagetian, and Pappertians, so to call them. And this is what I am looking for, because I am tired of these debates. They lead nowhere. And one of the important ideas is the idea that the tool that we create as a culture of bricoleurs and geeks can go astray if we don't think at all that the products that we leave out there, once they are in the public domain, they are no longer just a little extension of our philosophies of ourselves, but they are to be read and interpreted and used by other people the way they think it important. Now, designers cannot be accountable for predicting how whatever they propose will be used, but they can at least acknowledge that the things will live like an architect, that the building they build will live beyond them, and take a greater care into playing with the ideas of what might happen if you spread your own little contributions a little bit too mindlessly. So it's, in a way, if you want, it's makers is not good enough, because conquerors have been wonderful makers. You know, they just don't compose with what's there, whereas the idea is to actually compose with what's there. So that's the ecological side. The pragmatic side is to really look into the way tool use. Pogliani, people like Pogliani is of great help. The whole passage between expression, tool use, and when the tool becomes autonomous and it actually interacts with you like another person. Long answer, but not very.
So, thank you very much.